Welcome to the Bordeaux Show, an ongoing exploration of the famed region and its wines. I'm Ron Edwards, Master Sommelier and Director of Wine Education for Winebow. We invite you to place any questions or comments in the Q&A, as we will not be monitoring the chat window. Let me introduce your host, Certified Bordeaux Educator TJ Griffin. TJ has held many jobs within the wine industry, from hospitality to wholesale. Throughout his career, what he enjoyed most was learning about wine and sharing that knowledge with others. As the corporate wine educator for Winebow Fine Wine and Spirits, he now enjoys the privilege of doing what he loves full time. And now here to discuss today's topic, winemaking in Bordeaux, TJ Griffin. Hey, TJ.
Hey, Ron, how are you?
I am peachy.
Peachy. Wow. Mm-hmm. Well, that's good to be peachy. So we're going to talk about winemaking in Bordeaux. Our last webinar episode, we talked about viticulture in Bordeaux. And we framed it in terms of what was done in the past, what was being done in the present, and what was on the sort of the radar for the future. And if you remember, what we talked about was a lot of the innovations in wine in Bordeaux and pretty much throughout the world for a long time were in the cellar. And now it's sort of flipped. A lot of the innovation is taking place now in the vineyards. And a new term, wine growing, has been created, which really makes sense. It's not just growing grapes, it's growing grapes for wine. That being said, there's always something new in the cellar, and there's been a lot of huge developments in the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years in Bordeaux, 50 maybe even. We'll go back to, let's go back to just post-World War II. So we're talking 67 years. So we'll cover a lot of that. But it made more sense to me to cover this in terms of the winemaking process. So we'll start with the grapes arriving at the winery, and then we'll go through pre-fermentation techniques, fermentation, and post-fermentation. We'll talk about some of the pioneers and innovators in Bordeaux.
Sounds like a plan. Let's do it.
So, pre-fermentation techniques. You know what? When I was researching one of the great teachers of Bordeaux, Emil Noyer, one of his innovations was convincing people. So we're talking, just after World War II. We're talking convincing people to only use the best grapes, and that was shocking to me. Because we sort of take that for granted right now. But I don't know what your thoughts on that are, Ron. But is it an economic matter? People just used whatever they had. Some of the grapes maybe were underripe, some of them maybe were damaged, and they just all went into the process, or was it truly a matter of they didn't know how much that would affect the quality? Again, it's such a given now that I find it hard to conceive of why they would do that. But
tradition. Sing the song in your head if you like.
Tradition.
But this is the way we've always done it. What do you mean change, right?
Yeah.
That's true in just about any subject matter you want to talk about. But we have to also remember that at the time that he was asking people to do this, wine was a daily consumption commodity, caloric intake, part of your daily life, not $4,000 a case for your favorite Bordeaux kind of situation. And by throwing away product, you're making less wine. Less wine means less money or less wine to drink, if that was why you were making it. And it's only a recent invention, really, that the wine industry is what it is today, with rock stars and crazy expensive wines. It's not that they didn't have highly prized and expensive wines in the past, but they weren't the dry table wines. They were the rich, long-lived sweet wines. And I think that would have been met with the same sort of criticism and like, what are you talking about, as pick your favorite subject today, where we're asking people to change their behavior based on what is perceived as a possible good outcome instead of a guaranteed good outcome.
Yeah, we'll definitely talk more about it when we get to him, but he was mocked by the industry at the time for his innovations, until people saw wow, his wines are really good.
When you are being mocked as an innovator, you can guarantee you're actually innovating. You may not be successful, but you're definitely trying to change things.
So that's one of the innovations that we find is just picking better grapes for your wine. Hand sorting and picking out, MOG. Are you familiar with that acronym, Ron?
You reminded me of it when I saw the presentation. I'm not sure I would have come up with it on my own.
Matter other than grapes. So could be stems, could be twigs, could be leaves, could be bugs, could be a lot of stuff that we don't want in our wine. And I guarantee that some of the large volume wines that people consume contain some MOG because they're all just thrown in the hopper and that's the way it is. But one of the innovations was really picking only the best berries. So here we see some hand sorting, which is fairly common now for finer wines, where they're going through and they're discarding any grapes that are damaged, underripe, etc., picking out leaves, all that kind of stuff. So that's one of the innovations, which is somewhat labor intensive because you have to pay the people to do it. They have to be somewhat skilled to know what to look for. And as always, whenever there's a task that humans perform, someone says, how can we automate this? So this is an optical sorter, and I have seen one of these in action, as I'm sure you probably have, Ron.
I have not, actually.
Oh, you have not? Oh, it is the neatest thing. So, and it's amazing how fast it moves. So these, you can see this computer screen, it's not very well, but it will take pictures of all these grapes, and anything that is not, you can set the parameters however you want. It can be, I believe, for color, it can be for size, shape, etc. So you decide what you think is the perfect grape, and then you set the machine, and it will pass through at a fairly rapid pace, and little air vents will just blow off the grapes that you don't want, and it moves super fast. I don't know, it's amazing how quickly it moves. So you can sort it to your specifications and only get the perfect grape on the other end. And it's an investment. It's not inexpensive, but a lot of wineries, not just in Bordeaux, but all over the world, have invested in this. And then the next innovation, I was telling you offline about, I forget the chateau, but he was on the right bank of Saint-Emilion. And we were talking about sorting, and did he like optical sorting? Because I think I had read something on his website that it said optical sorting. And he said, I did like it, but I found something better, densimetric sorting. So this is,
this stuff's crazy.
Yeah, he invested in an optical sorter and then decided, nope, I want to do this instead. So this is a basically water table with a sugar solution. And again, you're setting the parameters, and the grapes that are ripe enough are going to be denser and heavier than the sugar solution. So they will fall to the bottom of this pool, where there's usually some sort of conveyor belt or sweeper that will push, move them along to keep, and anything else that is not up to those standards will float and be swept away and thrown away. So grapes that aren't ripe enough, any leaves that may have made it through, or anything like that. And this, as you can imagine, is also quite expensive. But
isn't this so counterintuitive, right? Because you spend all this time worrying about rain at the wrong time to swell up your grapes because it'll absorb water, and then you put it in a water bath. Obviously, if you understand osmosis principles and all of that stuff, you realize that a sugar solution will not put water into a grape, because now we're trying to match up. And so there can't be osmosis through the skin because it's the same density on each side, et cetera, et cetera. But the stuff they think up is amazing.
I don't know. It seems very logical. I don't know actually why it took so long to come up with this. This seems like something that could have been done years ago, but this is a relatively new innovation. So it's not so much the appearance, it's the actual chemical composition of the grape that is being measured here.
Mario threw in a comment that I'll throw in here, that he remembers, hopefully accurately, that Emil Noyer also came with the recommendation of second labels so that they could use the lower quality grapes. And he wanted to remind us of that, which thank you, Mario.
Yeah, Emil Noyer is definitely on the Mount Rushmore of enologists. I don't know who else would be up there, but I think we had talked about it in the last episode about the University of Bordeaux. I mean, it is one of the leading enology schools in the world. So yes, our webinar series is about Bordeaux, but legitimately they have really changed the face of winemaking in the last 50, 60 years. One of the things that came out of Bordeaux and the University of Bordeaux enologists was skin contact for white wines. We'll talk about Denis Dubourdieu. I always find that hard to say. It's like 3 different vowel sounds in one word. He was a proponent of minimal skin contact for white wines. And he did a lot across the spectrum of wine, but was really most famous for his work with dry white wines.
Okay, so what was his logic train for skin contact for whites?
You're getting you're getting flavor, you're getting structure. There's a lot of great stuff in the skins, not as much as you want for red wines, of course, but it was not for a while there, it was just you wouldn't want any skin contact was the thought with white wines. You just want to get the juice, but there's some good stuff in the white wines as well. We're not talking about orange wines. We're just talking, minimal skin contact that will add some complexity to the wines, get the fermentation going. It's a lot of benefits for making more powerful, more age-worthy dry white wines. So think of Pessac, Léognan, Grave, the wines that are. Also
a professor at the school.
Yes, he was.
Okay, that makes sense. Actually, I was just reflecting on my visits to Greece. The Greek winemakers are absolutely in adoration of skin contact on their whites, which actually in most of the cases is a good thing because it pulls out aromatics in grapes that have slight aromatics. But most of their most of the current generation of winemakers spent time in Bordeaux learning how to make wine and went to enology school there. So that tends to make a lot of sense that connection was made.
Yeah, I think I read a quote from Denis that he was sort of, he felt it had gone a little too far. And, I said, well, you're the skin contact guy. And he's like, well, brief skin contact for whites. We're not talking, too extended. Pre-fermentation, maceration, cold soak. So this is a picture of the berries soaking in juice. So what happens here, we think, is if you're keeping the grapes cold, and this can be done by temperature controlled tanks, it can be done using dry ice. Either way, you're spending some money and using resources. So it's not the most sustainable practice because you're using electricity or greenhouse gases basically in solid form. But what it in theory does is it will extract color and anthocyanins without the harsh tannins, and it hasn't started fermenting yet. So different things are soluble at different temperatures. So you're keeping it cold so it doesn't ferment. So you're getting a nice extracted red wine without any of those harsh tannins. It's somewhat I wouldn't say controversial, that's too strong a word, but there's disagreement on how effective it is. And is it dependent on certain grapes? Is it more effective with Pinot Noir and Grenache than it is with Cabernet and Merlot? But it's pretty widely practiced.
Yeah, it's certainly very common with those grapes you mentioned at the end there.
Yeah.
I think some of that is like in the New World, for instance, most of the regions are like, why would I try to extract more color? We've got plenty, right? And Bordeaux traditionally struggled with a little bit of color, but I don't know that that's really true anymore. So maybe that's why the argument is there, is that why are you doing this? We don't need this help anymore. I don't know.
Yeah, well, if you think, not too long ago, the term claret, what the Brits would say, or claret, comes from Bordeaux, and those were the most prized wines, and they were basically like a dark rosé. So this idea of we want deeper colored wines, we want this, is probably what people may have yearned for a while. And then by the time that they were able to figure out how to do it, it wasn't really needed anymore because there were so many advances in viticulture and using better grapes.
But even so, cold soak is a relatively new invention in the winery.
Yes. Well, as we'll talk about next with fermentation techniques, probably the biggest innovation in the world of winemaking, anywhere, was learning how to control the fermentation by controlling the temperature. Because if you don't control the temperature, you're at the mercy of whatever happens. It could be great, it could be not so great. So being able to control that was huge. And even I remember reading about Sicily, kind of getting into that controlled fermentation temperature a little later than maybe some other regions, and their wines exploded in quality overnight, 20, 30 years ago. So harnessing that and controlling the outcome as opposed to just letting it happen is huge, and costs money, and needs technology. You couldn't do a controlled cold soak 50 years ago. You just wouldn't have the means. So fermentation techniques, really three things to think about: the vessel used, the temperature, and the time. And we'll talk about those. So first, of course, is barrel fermentation. You throw the grapes in and they ferment, and when it's done, you bottle it. Really low maintenance, low tech, and this was kind of how things were done. And then the vessel itself, when you're having this, of course, you're extracting, if there's any, oak tannin or oak flavor left in the barrels, a lot of them are going to be neutral over time, but if there's any, it's going to extract those, which is usually desirable with red wines, but not always. But it will yield a different aromatic and flavor profile than a neutral vessel. And we think of old cellars, we think something like this. You can almost see like the mold on the walls, and this is very, kind of fairly common of what you think about the older cellars. But then you have this is a picture actually of one of the chateaus I was in. So you'll be in an old cellar with a extremely new temperature controlled vat. So you can see this is stainless steel and oak, and this is temperature controlled, and it's a fairly large vessel. So it's to me, it was very shocking to be walking through some of these really old cellars, and you'll see something like this, and then you turn the corner and you see something like this, and like, wow, how did that even get in there? But learning how to control the fermentation allows you to greatly affect the style of the wine. Slower is better, cooler is better. Here's another one, giant. This is a fairly modern site that you'll see. So these giant temperature controlled oak vats. Stainless steel, of course, is a lot easier to control. And you can do this this is another picture. It's not the greatest picture, because when I was taking it, I didn't know I was going to be doing a Bordeaux webinar series. I would have taken a clearer picture, but this was so impressive. This is all their tanks on the screen. They're monitoring all the temperatures, and they can adjust it, in minutely if they want to. And it's just really cool, the amount of control that they have over that. So, sorry, Ed.
Well, I was hoping you were going to come to some sort of like cause and effect relationship for folks who are listening when you talk about temperature of fermentation, especially on reds.
Yes. So the lower the fermentation, the longer it's going to take you, and you're going to develop you have time to do things. So you can develop lots of aromas and flavors and complexity. When the hotter it is, the faster it's going to move, and it's just going to be done before anything really could happen. You also have time to do techniques that we'll talk about, like punch overs and punch downs and spray overs and stuff like that, to really extract everything that you want from the grapes. If you have an uncontrolled fermentation, you just won't have the time for that as well. So it's not to be, there are wines, of course, that we still do that way. So for stuff like port, we want a rapid, heavily extracted, fermentation. So it's very quick and it's very hot and it just goes and it's done. But for these wines, it really benefited to slow it down and keep it cool. Sorry, go ahead.
What other risks might happen with the hot, uncontrolled fermentation? Are there other chemicals that get released that are unpleasant? Are you more likely to have volatile acidity? Is it more likely?
Yeah, there's all kinds of
that stuff.
Yeah, all kinds of things that we would consider faults like that. Volatile acidity, which still you'll see a lot in the so-called natural wines where temperatures aren't controlled, and you'll see a lot of volatile acidity sometimes, which can be, I don't know, what's the marker for you, Ron? Smell and taste like soy sauce, or some people say ketchup, but there's like almost a vinegary kind of unpleasant. I don't mind a little bit of it.
Right.
It's present in a lot of Italian wines.
A little bit of VA for me is like somebody's drizzled some balsamic vinegar in your wine. And then when it starts to get elevated, it goes from that to, normally there's this line where it gets elevated and then it starts to become ethyl acetate instead of just acidity. And so once you get to that point, now you're talking about nail polish remover in your wine. Yeah. And there's a lot of wines out there that smell that way that people drink. And certain grapes are more susceptible to it than others. Thankfully, the Bordeaux grapes are not as susceptible to that as some other grapes. But yeah, once it goes past a little thread of balsamic vinegar, I can't take it. But.
Yeah, I'm sort of the same way with Brett. Like a very little bit, sure, I'm okay with, but it goes over the line very quickly with me. Which is another thing to talk about. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we should clarify with the audience that volatile acidity has its sources in other things. There are some yeasts that put out volatile acidity automatically, which is a risk when you do native yeast population fermentation. And then the other is it's bacterial, is the most common, right? The bacteria that is used to make vinegar shows up in your winery. And it's hard not to have it around. So that's why you have to protect from it. It's not just a byproduct of temperature of fermentation. It's all of those things combined. And ethyl acetate, for instance, isn't always a byproduct of the bacteria changing things. Sometimes there's some angry yeast in the world that actually put out ethyl acetate as a byproduct. There's one in Michigan called Clecera. I don't know where else it is, but that one is horrible, which is why they don't use native yeast in Michigan at all.
Yeah, and there's another thing that Emil Noyer championed, and again, to me, this is a duh, but hygiene. If you look at this versus this, what's going to be more control? What's going to yield the winemaker's vision as opposed to whatever's in the cellar?
But TJ, there's no terroir here. You have eliminated. No, we just eliminated a lot of yuck.
Well, fermentation was always, native and wild for a long time there. And there's good and bad. And the strongest yeast wins. And it's not necessarily the one you want. So inoculating with yeast was a huge innovation, and choosing which yeast and what aspects of the wine you wanted to accentuate and what aspects of the wine you wanted to de-emphasize. Now we're kind of coming back full circle to control, I wouldn't say wild yeast, or
controlling nature a bit.
Yeah, controlling, people are isolating the yeasts from their vineyard or from their winery, or both, that they like, and they'll send off to a lab. They'll do a different yeast strains and they'll say, yep, that's the one I want. So it is sort of combining the best of both worlds. You're controlling it, but you're also showcasing your particular yeast or terroir. But hygiene, I remember when I did this is years ago, I did presentation on faults and flaws in wine, and nearly all of them can be prevented with good hygiene. I mean, it's just a no-brainer. But apparently, when Emil Noyer was championing hygiene, it was not the norm. Mm-hmm. So now you can see wineries are very, very clean, well taken care of.
Yeah, it used to be unheard of for your surgeon to wash his hands prior to.
Yes. Yes.
All of these things have progressed, thankfully.
So some techniques. This is actually from a presentation that I found on the Bordeaux school website. So it's not the greatest in that it doesn't explain everything, but these are some machines. So the grapes are fermenting, but we want to extract color and flavor and aromas. So what do we do? And also, Ron, as you know, the skins and all the pomace and stuff will form a cap on the wine. So you want, and that's where all the good stuff is. So underneath is the juice. Here you have the cap where all the skins and stuff are. So people would use their feet. People would use paddles. People would use all kinds of things. The more, I don't say violent, but the more vigorous you are, is the more tannins you're going to get. So depending on the style of wine you want to make, you might want to do a gentle pump over. So this is a machine that takes juice from the bottom of underneath the cap and will spray it over the cap, which then sinks through again back into the juice. So you're just keeping the cap moist and you're still extracting, but it's a gentle extraction. And then you have something like this. This is an automatic plunger. This will be a little more vigorous, but it can be controlled. So as a punch down, so you see on the right, that will just move up and down. And it can be timed, it can be set, so you don't have to be there necessarily. This is a turbo pigeur, which is very interesting. Again, so spraying over, you can see the diagram on the left, spraying over the cap. Those dots are supposed to be the cap. So these are all innovations that allowed you to extract more flavor, extract more aroma, extract tannin, but in a gentle manner, while having your long, cool fermentation.
Yep. Now, one of the byproducts of not doing spray overs is less oxygen, right? So that the cap sitting on top also prevents oxygen from getting to your fermenting juice. So it's always a trade-off. And I know you're going to talk about micro-ox and all of that, so I won't jump in too soon. But some of my favorite wines are still made with hand punch downs in oak barrels that we like that picture we saw. And some of the wines I love are made with these more modern techniques, and it just depends on the producer and what they're after.
Yeah, there's the two ends of the spectrum in winemaking are oxidized and reduced. And at the extremes, neither one is very desirable. Making a wine in a reductive manner is trying to prevent as much oxygen from getting in as possible. And the other would be allowing it. And there's pros and cons to each, and it really depends on the grape you're using and the desired style. But yes, the controlling oxygen, either limiting it or allowing it in certain amounts, is another huge innovation that has taken place in the last 30, 40 years and has allowed for winemakers to greatly affect the style. And one of the innovations that is still going on today, as you just said, is micro-oxygenation. So this is at the bottom of your tank is a device that it's porous, and it will allow, it's connected to a hose, and will allow minute amounts of oxygen to bubble up into the fermenting wine. So what does that do? So it can be done, the same process can be achieved by putting your wine in oak barrels and leaving them there, because oak is somewhat porous and there is some oxygen ingress to the wine. It's very tiny and it's very slow. And what happens is it helps polymerize the tannins. So the tannins are, single molecules, and then polymerization is when they start to form chains. And those chains, as we perceive them on our palate, are it's finer, it's smoother, it's softer. And that's why you would age wine for a long time. This process mimics that, but it does it very quickly. So it was a way for wines to be enjoyable upon release, but still have the structure to age. We've talked about that in past webinars now, that's it's not an either or anymore. Oh, I can't drink this now. Yeah, you can drink it now. And you can age it. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. And this was the fad for a while. Everyone talked about micro ox. What do you think about micro oxygenation, Ron?
Well, I like the fact that you're mimicking what a barrel can do without the hygiene risks of oak, right? So that's really where it came from, is we're eliminating oak fermentation in favor of more hygienic methods. And then the accidental result of that was reductive wines, because now they didn't realize how much oxygen they were robbing from the fermentation process. Now they're putting it back. My only knock on it was that everybody was doing it the same way for a while, same rates and everything else. And so the wines, as a result, because one or two consultants were dominating Bordeaux, and we could talk about who they were, but we're going to get there later, I think. And so the wine started tasting the same. And there really wasn't a big difference between different chateaux. And that I didn't like, but it wasn't the fault of micro-ox. Micro-ox in and of itself is a very good idea. It's like all good ideas. It's how are they applied? And if it's uniform across the board of all winemakers, then that can be a problem.
Well, a lot of the innovations in winemaking and now in the vineyard are about controlling factors. So if you are fermenting in stainless steel or concrete or whatever that's neutral, especially with something like stainless steel, you're getting a purity of fruit with the product. Instead of barrel fermentation, which is extracting a lot of oak, now, if you're doing this micro-ox in a stainless steel tank, you have starting to polymerize the tannins. They're softer, they're finer. It's a more elegant wine. It also has the purity of fruit. And now you can control somewhat, or to a great degree, how much oak influence you're going to have, because now you're going to put it in barrels and now you can age that, but you don't have to do the barrel fermentation. So you can have sort of the best of both worlds, the oak influence with the purity of fruit and the tannins without time, and hygiene, as you said. So it's an interesting technique, and it allows for more control, basically. And yeah, we'll definitely get back to the consultants in just a sec. So post-fermentation techniques, one of the innovations that everyone talks about is post-fermentation maceration. So the wine is done fermenting, and you just leave it on the skins and seeds, and it's going to continue to extract. It actually it can fix color. It can actually make the wines more lightly colored. So it's kind of, it's confusing. Like, do you want the wines deeply colored, or do you not want them deeply colored? Because if you're doing this, it actually will lighten the color over time. And this is another controversial technique, in that there's people that say it does one thing, there's people say it does another thing, there's people say you shouldn't do it for certain grapes, people say you should do it. I remember reading about micro-ox when I first heard about it, and somebody, I forget who, but it was a very well-known winemaker, said, nobody understands micro-oxygenation. They use it, they know what it, they like the result, but they don't know what's going on. And we have to wait to find out what's going on. So I think we kind of know now, but at the time, people were using it, they didn't even know what it was doing. And that's kind of the thing with this. Somebody does it, some consultant says we should do post-fermentation maceration, so everybody does it without maybe understanding the pros and cons of it. But you can see here in the picture some seeds. You do not want, a little bit's okay, but you don't want a lot of seed tannin in your wine, because it can be bitter. And the longer you're going to let it sit there, the more it's going to extract. They're not extracted easily, but they will be extracted if you let them sit for a while. So, but this is another post-fermentation technique, other than, aging and barrel and stuff like that. that is quite popular in Bordeaux and elsewhere.
I think this is basically a return to antiquity, because if you look at, I mean, real antiquity, like Rome, people who made wines had these in the ground amphora and large, stone vats or whatever with a lid on it, and they would pour all the grapes and everything in there and get some people to stomp on them if necessary, and let it ferment, and it would just sit in there, and they would draw it out and then filter out the mog and drink it, and it just stayed that way till they were done with it. So this is not new. This, once again, we're exploring why they do this in 300 BC. They didn't tell us. Well, let's try it again.
Yeah, exactly. I imagine there's a period of time where you're like, okay, that had some beneficial effects, but you do have to know what you're doing. You wouldn't want to let it sit forever. So I imagine when they got towards the end of the amphora, that wine wasn't as good.
No, probably not. But remember, even more so then, wine was made, consumed, and remade. There wasn't a whole lot of aging of wine in the ancient world. A little bit, not much.
So the role of the consultant is very much a Bordeaux thing. I'm not sure if you would say they created it, but they certainly propagated it. And we talked about him. So here he is, Emil Peynaud, the forefather of modern enology. So he you can't say too much about what he did for winemaking around the world, not just Bordeaux, but he wrote 2 books, both of which are fantastic. One is called Knowing and Making Wine, which is somewhat technical, and one is Tasting Wine, the Art and Science of Wine Appreciation, which is also technical, but more for the consumer rather than the winemaker. Started working with, at the age of 15, kids started young then. You started working on what would be your career probably when you're still in what we would call high school. And then basically with another man, Jean Ribeiro-Gaillon, we'll talk about in a minute. So Peynaud completed his doctorate at the University of Bordeaux in 1946. So we're just after World War II now. And then he and Jean basically started the enology program. So they're both considered like the forefathers of modern enology. And he had so much effect on things. As I said, hygiene, using the best grapes. He had a big effect on dry white wines in Bordeaux. But he was asked what he thought was his biggest contribution to winemaking. And he said it was controlling malolactic fermentation. So that was another thing that was not in the control of the winemaker. It just happened. And as one source put it, it was considered sort of a sickness in the wine. And you try to prevent it, you try to control it, and nobody could do it. And he's the one that perfected controlling malolactic fermentation. So something that we totally take for granted now, but at the time was a huge innovation. So you heard me mention Jean Ribeiro-Gaillon. That was Pascal. That was his father. So Pascal Ribeiro-Gaillon was the next generation who learned from Emil Peynaud and taught at the University of Bordeaux for many, many, many years. And he taught, among other people, you can see Denis Dubourdieu and Michel Rolland. Denis Dubourdieu was a hugely influential teacher and winemaker who passed away fairly young. It was somewhat sudden. Let me see the date. Well, the date's not important, but it was a bit of a shocker because he was still at the height of his game. Michel Rolland is a controversial figure because of, did you ever see Mondovino, Ron?
Never saw it. It was one of those things where so many people asked me if I'd seen it. I just decided I was never going to see it. I'm kind of rebellious like that.
Yeah, I've my thing with that is the Blair Witch Project. I've still never seen the Blair Witch Project.
I neither.
Everybody saw it, and then I kind of knew the twist. So I'm like, but the twist in Mondovino is it sort of had an agenda about sort of anti-Michel Rolland or anti-consultant And it sort of cherry picked. He was very, very upset with how he was portrayed in the movie. It sort of cherry picked that he waltzes into your winery and says, here's what you need to do, micro oxygenation. That'll be 200,000 euro. And then he leaves. And it's a lot more to it than that. He's one of the world's top consultants. He consults all over the world, not just in France and Bordeaux. And he will, he and his team will help you out in the vineyard. They will help you out in the winery. He is not as big a proponent of micro ox as he has been portrayed. He actually said it only really makes sense for certain, if your wines are very tannic. Micro ox was started for Tannat in Mataron, which is a hugely tannic grape. It wasn't a Bordeaux thing. It was close by, but it's really a tannin management thing. So Michel rebels against that portrayal of him. Stéphane de Renoncourt, he's the one out of this group that I actually got to meet when I was in Bordeaux. He's self-taught. He just started working in wineries and vineyards, and now he's a huge consultant. But you see this all throughout Bordeaux. These are just a handful of some of the more well-known and more influential ones, but there's more I could have put on here. This role of the consulting winemaker and going all over the world, there's a lot of it in Bordeaux. There's certainly others in Italy and Australia and the US, and I've met a lot of people, but Bordeaux seems to have the majority of these really well-known winemaking consultants. And they most often came from an academic background. Michel Rolland studied under Pascal and studied under Emil Noyer, as did Denis Dubourdieu. Stéphane de Renoncourt, I'm sure, has padded his real-world learning with some academic learning as well, but just an amazing tradition of going from academia into the real world and then spreading that. And now these companies, they have, teams of consultants that will go to your winery, and you can say, look, I just want to make my wine a little richer, or you can say, you do the work. It depends on how much of a role you want them to play. They can basically be your winemaker if that's what you want, or they can just help you tweak some things. So, and everything in between.
Yes, and their calling cards are often the scores they receive from critics, and
yes,
that's how they get their jobs. So one thing that they often get knocked for is that they make a style. They make a style of wine per person, and you hire a consultant based on the style of wine that they're known for. I don't know if it's entirely true, but that's certainly the rep they get.
Yeah, so Michel Rolland was criticized for that because the style of wines he was making, whether it's his personal style or not, was what Robert Parker liked, and it would get the 95s and the 94s. And if your winery is getting 89s one vintage and the next one it gets a 95, you just made a lot of money. And then you say, well, what'd you do? Well, I hired Michel Rolland. Well, I'm hiring Michel Rolland, so then he's consulting all over. I remember when he was, when all this controversy was going on, I asked someone from Bordeaux that I was working with that knew the industry, is this really true? And he said, no, they make it. He said, this is the way it is. If you have 6 wines, one's from Saint-Emilion and the other 5 from Napa, and Michel, Michel made the Saint-Emilion, consulted for it. He's like, you're still going to say it's Bordeaux. You're not going to confuse it for California. But if you have 6 Saint-Emilion wines and one of them was made by Michel Rolland, you'll know that one as well. So within that framework, it did denote a certain style. And again,
a very politically correct way to say, yeah, Michel Rolland makes the same style of wine wherever he goes.
Well, there's another thing. I was at a Grand Cru Saint-Emilion tasting, and each winery noted their consulting winemaker. Mm-hmm. And I noticed that out of the several dozen wineries, 3 names accounted for about 90% of the room. And I do think that there is a danger, and we can talk about this next, of some homogeneity in the wines. If it's a few people doing the same things over and over, is that dangerous? And so here we go. So this is my image for perfection. So I want to pose two questions to you and the group. Mm-hmm. One is, because there's been some criticism of things like the densimetric sorter and having everything perfect, controlling the temperature. Does that maybe take away from the character of the wine? Is it good to have some slight imperfections in the wine? Does that give it more character? Does that give it more vintage specificity? Can the winemaking process, can the grapes and the winemaking process be too perfect? And the corollary question to that is, and again, if everyone's using the same winemaking techniques, are you having a sameness, and are you losing character of terroir and appellation and chateau? And even the blurring of what we've seen, Ron, as international wines too, where wines from California taste like the wines from Argentina, which tastes like the wines from Bordeaux, which tastes like the wines from Australia. So what are your thoughts on those two questions?
The end result of formulaic winemaking is formulaic wine. The end result of uncontrolled winemaking is an unknown result. And so my simple answer is the right mix is somewhere between. Completely uncontrolled winemaking rarely results in a great wine. Formulaic winemaking will result in a wine that's instantly delicious, but not necessarily characterful. And I think it's very interesting conversation, and I don't know what the right mix is. And anyone who knows me knows I'm not a proponent of fully natural production method, because I've tasted the results, and so far I've had very few that I would consider great wines. That means that by the norm is that's just too natural. We invented all of these ways to control it because we realized there were problems, and so why go backwards? But this idea of like the densimetric sorting, if every year you're able to select berries that are within a plus minus 3% of the year before in all characters, you're eliminating vintage variation. And that's one of the things we criticize some parts of the world for as wine lovers, because there doesn't seem to be variation. And we compliment the difficulty existing in other places where we get the reward 3 years out of 5 or 2 years out of 5 or 1 year out of 10 of, wow, that was a great vintage, unbelievable. But these people are in business, and good wine is what they sell. And so I don't blame them for their efforts to get more consistency. I think it's very interesting that the old world is really cognizant of the pressure that's being put upon them by the new world winemaking, where winemaking is in general more consistent. A lot of the regions are more weather consistent, where you don't have giant vintage variation. And the world populace is more and more into a predictable product, where they go out and they want to know, is this going to suit my taste? So I have empathy for old world winemaking families and the pressure they're under to move towards more homogeneity and away from individuality. I just hope they don't all give in.
Yeah, I mean, you nailed it. If you're a business owner, which most of these are family run, family owned small businesses, it's an economic decision that it's easy to criticize when you have no skin in the game. But when it's your livelihood and the future of your family. But yes, the climate has sort of evened out some rough areas. The technology in the vineyard and in the winery has evened out a lot of areas, and the consultants and their knowledge and their effects on styles. And the influence of critics has waned somewhat, but is the damage done, I guess, would be the question for that. So.
And by the way, TJ, don't forget the influence of importers.
Yep.
Not as big a deal in Bordeaux, but all the other countries, absolutely. Importer choice in Burgundy is a big deal. Importer choice in Spain is a huge deal. Importer choice in Italy is a big deal, where actually it's now the importer who's starting to dictate style. Mm-hmm. And we could have our bad behavior specialists by name. I don't wish to do that in a public setting, but where the importers' wines all taste the same regardless of region, right?
Yep.
And so it's not just about these consulting winemakers, and that also is an economic decision.
Yeah, and you're controlling what the customers access, and ultimately the customers don't even know that there are other choices out there.
Yeah, they don't realize that that's not what all Spanish wine tastes like, or all Italian wine tastes like, etc.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I wonder if it has somewhat the backlash to that is the natural wine craze and the orange wine. Just, so people that are just super wine geeks and they're so sick of trying the same thing over and over, and here's something to get excited about, even if it's a little off, even if it's a little flawed. I don't know. I'm not sure the connection is correct, but it might be. We'll see.
Mario brings up an Italian example of Riccardo Cottorella as a potential target for someone saying, well, all his wines taste the same. I don't know if that's entirely true, but anytime that you believe that you understand techniques and that you have an approach to winemaking, it's very possible for your wines to turn out similarly, especially if you're making them out of the same grape, right?
Right.
I hesitate to make a judgment in that regard. Even in regards to Michel Rolland, after all of the hullabaloo went away, I took a step back and looked down from 30,000 feet and said, well, is it really his fault, or are the clients asking him to make that wine because that guy down the street just got a 95 and I want one too, right? It's so convoluted. It's really not possible to blame one person.
Well, one thing, and I'm sure that Michel Rolland is skilled enough to do whatever he wants in the world of wine, but he tends to be the consultant for Bordeaux varieties, right? And Bordeaux blends and cabs. One of the things about Riccardo Cottorella, or if a gentleman that I think of sort of his counterpart in Portugal, João Portugal Ramos, is they work with many different regions, many different grapes, and many different styles, which again, I'm sure Michel would have no problem doing, but he's sort of limited to, he's the Bordeaux guy. At least they get the opportunity to work in different styles and different price points and different regions and grapes, which is a little more versatile, I guess. But yes, there's probably somebody in every major wine region in the world that somebody is against because they're the leading consultant in that area. And if you think about your on-premise background, Ron, I know that I've worked with chefs that have bounced around from restaurant to restaurant, different cuisines, but it's a style, and you either like it. I, would follow them around, say, because I want that food, and it might be French, or it might be Italian, or it might be, contemporary American, or whatever. But they have a certain influence that's the way they do things, and it's not even necessarily a conscious thing. It's who they are.
It's who they are, and it's the flavor that appeals to them, regardless of the approach. Yep, totally true. What's next? Oh my goodness.
What is next? That was it, Ron. That was our last webinar in this Bordeaux series, and it's been a lot of fun, and I thank you for joining me on this.
My pleasure.
Your opinions and observations have made this a much better series than I would have been able to do by myself. So merci to you, and thank you.
And I thank you for doing all the research that I didn't want to do, so I could just sit here and critique and add social commentary.
And thank you to all of those who have tuned in, both live and on YouTube. And you can always see all of these episodes on YouTube, where they will live on the Winebow YouTube channel. And stay tuned for, pay attention to your email for what's coming up next from both myself and Mr. Ron Edwards. Have new projects coming out. So those will be in your inboxes soon. And reach out with any questions, and just, thanks for joining me on this trip through Bordeaux. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And we'll see you on the next project. Bye, everybody.
Au revoir.